I don't have a family for Thanksgiving. Can I just stand here and watch the other families eat? The wind moved down Michigan Avenue like a sheet of ice, rattling the glass doors of the restaurant and sending loose napkins skittering across the sidewalk. But the little girl standing near the entrance didn't move an inch as people in warm coats passed her by, their laughter drifting into the night like music that didn't belong to her world, and the only thing protecting her from the cold was a thin cream-colored dress that looked like it had once been meant for a school recital or a church gathering, but now hung slightly wrinkled and too light for a Chicago November, where the temperature had already fallen to 32 degrees, the kind of cold that made breath visible in the air like tiny clouds. Her name was Emma Carter, 8 years old, small enough that the brass handle on the restaurant door sat almost level with her shoulder. And every few seconds she pressed her palms together under her chin, trying to warm her fingers while she stared through the tall glass window where a long Thanksgiving table glowed with golden light plates of roasted turkey and bowls of mashed potatoes surrounded by smiling families leaning close to hear one another over the gentle music playing inside. And Emma watched them the way a child might watch snowfall through a classroom window, quietly, carefully, as if making too much movement might shatter the moment. A man in a dark overcoat slowed as he passed and glanced down at her dress, then at the restaurant sign, confusion flickering across his face before he continued walking. Because on Thanksgiving night, Chicago was full of people hurrying towards somewhere they belonged, and a lonely little girl standing outside a five-star restaurant simply didn't fit the picture anyone expected to see. Emma shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her shoes tapping softly against the stone step, as another burst of laughter floated out each time the door opened. And for a second, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to sit at that table, to hear someone say her name, to have a plate set in front of her. But the door closed again. The warmth disappeared, and Emma Carter remained where she had been all evening outside, quiet, watching Thanksgiving happen for everyone else. Emma Carter remained by the tall restaurant window as the wind drifted across the street and lifted the loose ends of her thin dress, and every few seconds her small breath fogged the glass while the warmth from inside painted her cheeks with a soft golden glow that never quite reached her hands. She studied the families seated around the long Thanksgiving table as if she were watching a quiet movie through the glass, noticing little details that most people inside probably never even realized were happening, the way a father leaned down to cut a piece of turkey for his son, the way a grandmother laughed with her hand over her heart, the way candles flickered gently beside plates piled high with roasted turkey, stuffing sweet potatoes and cranberry sauce. And Emma pressed her forehead lightly against the cool window, because the warmth on the other side looked like the kind of place where people said things like, "Welcome home, and we saved you a seat." A server walked past her carrying a tray filled with steaming plates, and the smell of turkey drifted briefly through the door as a family stepped outside to take a photograph together under the glowing lights above the entrance. And Emma quickly stepped aside to give them space, lowering her eyes so no one would feel uncomfortable seeing her standing there alone. When the door closed again, the quiet returned, and the street light above cast a soft circle of pale light on the sidewalk where Emma stood, and she slowly smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, the way someone might fix their clothes before entering a special dinner, even though she knew she was not going inside. She whispered something very softly to herself that the passing traffic almost carried away, a small, hopeful sentence that sounded more like a wish than a plan. Because in a city as big as Chicago, it was easy for a little girl to believe that somewhere behind one of those glowing windows, there might still be a place where someone would notice her and say that she did not have to stand outside anymore. Emma Carter slowly stepped back from the restaurant window when another family inside stood up to take pictures together near the long table. And for a moment, the bright camera flash lit the glass so strongly that her own reflection appeared clearly in front of her. A small girl in a thin cream-colored dress standing alone on a cold Chicago sidewalk, while everyone else inside leaned together, smiling for a holiday photograph. She studied that reflection quietly, as if she were looking at a stranger. And then she gently brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way she had seen mothers do for their daughters earlier that evening, trying to look neat even though there was no one there to notice. And she folded her hands together to keep them warm, as another gust of wind rolled through the street, carrying the distant sound of car horns and the faint smell of roasted turkey from inside the restaurant. A couple stepped out through the front door, laughing softly as they zipped their coats, and when they noticed Emma standing nearby, they paused with a small look of surprise before the woman crouched slightly and asked in a careful voice if she was waiting for her parents. And Emma looked down at the stone sidewalk for a moment, before lifting her eyes again with a calm honesty that did not sound dramatic or angry, only simple and quiet, and she said that she was not waiting for anyone tonight, because there was no one coming for her, and the woman seemed unsure what to say after that, while the man beside her glanced back toward the warm restaurant behind them, where the laughter and clinking glasses continued. After a few seconds, they wished her a gentle, happy Thanksgiving and walked toward their car, their footsteps fading across the parking lot, while Emma remained near the glowing window, once again watching the celebration continue inside, as the cold Chicago night slowly wrapped around the silent sidewalk where she stood. Inside the restaurant, the warmth wrapped around every table like a quiet celebration of comfort and belonging, and near the back of the dining room, a man sat alone at a small table by the window. His dark coat folded neatly over the chair beside him, while a single plate of Thanksgiving dinner rested untouched in front of him. His name was Daniel Whitmore, though no one in the restaurant seemed to realize that the quiet man sitting by himself was the founder of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country, a billionaire whose name appeared in business magazines and financial news, but who tonight had chosen to spend the holiday in a simple corner table without assistance or security. Just a glass of water and a plate of food he had barely looked at since it arrived. Daniel watched the room, slowly noticing the families gathered together in warm conversations, while servers carried trays of turkey and pumpkin pie from one table to another. But his attention kept drifting back to the tall front window near the entrance, where the faint outline of a small figure could be seen standing outside beneath the soft glow of the streetlight. At first he assumed it was simply a child waiting for her parents, perhaps bored during the long dinner. But as the minutes passed, he noticed something unusual that made him glance up again and again, because the little girl never moved away from the window, and no adult ever came to stand beside her. Each time the front door opened, a gust of cold November air slipped inside, and the girl remained outside in the same thin dress, her small shape barely shifting, while the celebration continued on the other side of the glass. Daniel slowly set his fork down and leaned slightly toward the window, studying the quiet scene beyond the restaurant lights. And there was something about the way the child stood there, not knocking, not asking, simply watching, that stirred a memory deep inside him of another cold evening many years ago when he had also stood outside somewhere he did not belong, wondering if anyone would ever notice he was there. Daniel Whitmore continued watching the quiet figure outside the restaurant window while the rest of the dining room remained wrapped in the warm noise of Thanksgiving dinner, the soft clinking of glasses and gentle laughter blending with the distant jazz music drifting from hidden speakers above the tables. Yet his attention no longer belonged to the celebration around him because the small girl outside had not moved from her place beneath the streetlight for what must have been nearly an hour. He noticed the way she stood with her hands folded close to her chest, as if trying to hold warmth inside her sleeves, and every now and then she leaned slightly toward the glass to watch the families inside sharing plates of turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie, her expression calm and quiet rather than impatient, which somehow made the scene feel even heavier to Daniel than if she had been knocking or asking to come in. A server approached his table and politely asked if everything was all right with his meal, but Daniel simply nodded and thanked her before glancing once more toward the entrance where the tall glass doors reflected the golden restaurant lights against the dark Chicago night outside. Through that reflection, he could still see the small girl standing there, the thin cream-colored dress fluttering slightly in the wind that swept along the sidewalk each time a car passed on the avenue. And Daniel felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, because something about the image seemed strangely familiar, Not just the cold evening or the lonely posture, but the quiet patience in the way she watched other people celebrate something she clearly was not part of. He reached for his glass of water, but paused before taking a sip as another memory rose slowly in his mind. A memory of a much younger version of himself, standing alone outside a brightly lit building many years ago, while families gathered inside, and he realized that the same silent question he had once carried in his own heart seemed to be standing right there on the sidewalk tonight, in the form of a little girl named Emma Carter. Daniel Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair while the quiet image outside the window refused to leave his mind, and the longer he watched the small figure standing beneath the streetlight, the more certain he became that the girl was not simply waiting for someone to return from inside the restaurant, because no parent had come out to check on her, and no car had stopped beside the curb to pick her up. He glanced around the dining room once more at the families enjoying their meals, the golden glow of the lights reflecting off polished silverware and warm plates of food. And for a moment, he wondered how many people inside had even noticed the child, standing just a few feet away on the other side of the glass. Daniel finally raised his hand and quietly motioned for one of the servers who had passed his table earlier, and when she approached, he asked in a calm voice if she had seen the little girl standing outside near the entrance, the one in the light-colored dress beneath the streetlight. The server turned slightly toward the window and nodded after a brief glance, before explaining that the girl had been there for quite some time, and that a few employees had noticed her earlier but assumed she was waiting for family members who were dining somewhere nearby. Daniel listened carefully and asked if anyone had spoken to her yet, and the server gently shook her head before adding that sometimes children waited outside during long dinners because they became restless inside, though she admitted it was unusual for someone so young to remain alone for so long on a cold night when the temperature had already dropped close to freezing. Daniel thanked her quietly and watched as she returned to her work. Yet the explanation did not ease the uneasy feeling growing inside his chest, because the scene outside still carried a silence that did not look like a child simply passing time. Emma Carter continued standing near the window with her hands folded together, her attention fixed on the warm room beyond the glass, while cars rolled past along the avenue, and the wind lifted the edges of her thin dress again, and Daniel realized that he could no longer pretend she was just another passing detail in the evening, because the longer he looked, the more it felt as if that lonely figure outside had somehow become the most important thing in the entire restaurant. Emma Carter slowly stepped away from the restaurant window after another burst of laughter rose from the dining room inside, because standing so close to the glass made it feel almost as if she were part of the celebration, even though she knew she was not, and she did not want anyone inside to notice her staring too long at their table. The cold air wrapped around her immediately as she moved toward the edge of the sidewalk, where a small stone step bordered the entrance, and she carefully lowered herself onto it, while folding her hands between her knees in an attempt to keep them warm. Her thin dress offering almost no protection against the Chicago wind that drifted between the tall buildings along the avenue. Cars passed by with their headlights reflecting across the wet pavement, and every few seconds, the distant sound of horns and engines echoed softly through the street, while the restaurant behind her continued glowing like a warm island of light in the middle of the cold evening. Emma tilted her head slightly upward and watched a few small snowflakes begin to fall from the dark sky above the city, drifting slowly beneath the streetlight, before melting the moment they touched the sidewalk. And she held out her hand for a second, as if hoping one might land on her palm, but the wind carried them away before they could reach her. Inside the restaurant, Daniel Whitmore had moved closer to the window without realizing it, standing near the side of the dining room, where he could still see the entrance clearly, and he noticed the exact moment the girl lowered herself onto the step outside, her shoulders small and still beneath the falling snow. The sight made him pause in a way that felt deeper than simple curiosity, because there was something heartbreakingly patient in the way she sat there quietly, rather than knocking on the door or asking anyone for help. Emma pulled her feet slightly closer together and rested her chin lightly on her hands as the soft snow continued drifting through the streetlight, and although the restaurant behind her remained filled with voices and warmth, the little circle of sidewalk where she sat felt very quiet, as if the city itself had stepped back and left one small girl alone with the cold night and her silent hope that somehow the evening might still change. The light snow continued drifting through the glow of the street lamp, while Emma Carter remained seated on the cold stone step outside the restaurant. Her small shoes pressed together and her hands tucked between her knees as she quietly watched the busy street in front of her. Every now and then, a car slowed near the curb, while passengers stepped out laughing and adjusting their coats before walking quickly toward the warm entrance behind her. And each time the restaurant door opened, the golden light and the rich smell of roasted turkey spilled briefly onto the sidewalk before the door closed again and the warmth disappeared. Emma did not try to follow anyone inside, and she did not ask for attention. She simply looked toward the passing families with a calm expression that seemed older than her 8 years, as if she had already learned that some doors were meant for other people. A group of 3 teenagers walked past the entrance, carrying small shopping bags and cups of hot chocolate, their voices loud and cheerful as they talked about the football game they had watched earlier that afternoon, and one of them noticed Emma sitting quietly on the step and slowed for a moment with a curious glance. Before the others continued down the sidewalk, their laughter fading into the night, while the snowflakes continued drifting softly around the streetlight. Emma lowered her eyes toward the pavement again and drew a small shape on the stone beside her with the tip of her shoe, a simple circle that slowly filled with melting snow. And although the cold wind brushed against her thin dress, she remained there without complaining or calling out to anyone. Inside the restaurant, Daniel Whitmore stood near the window with his hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair while he watched the quiet scene unfolding outside. And he noticed the way the little girl did not chase after the warmth that appeared each time the door opened, but instead stayed exactly where she was, patient and silent beneath the falling snow. Something about that quiet patience made it impossible for him to return to his seat, because the longer he observed her, the more certain he became that the evening outside the restaurant had become far more important than the celebration happening inside. The snowflakes continued falling slowly through the glow of the streetlight, while Emma Carter remained seated on the cold stone step outside the restaurant. The quiet night around her, filled with the distant sounds of passing cars and muffled laughter drifting from inside the warm building behind her. The Thanksgiving dinner inside had reached the point where servers were beginning to carry slices of pumpkin pie and cups of coffee to the tables, and each time the door opened, the warm light spilled across the sidewalk for a brief moment before fading again as the door gently closed. Emma watched the glow appear and disappear like a small window into a world she could almost touch, but never quite reach. And although the cold wind brushed against her bare arms, she stayed exactly where she was, her small shoulders steady beneath the falling snow, as if she had quietly decided that leaving would somehow make the night even lonelier. Inside the restaurant, Daniel Whitmore remained standing near the window, no longer pretending to study the busy dining room around him, because his attention was fixed entirely on the little girl outside. And with every passing minute, the uneasy feeling in his chest grew stronger as he noticed the tiny details that most people would have missed, the way she occasionally rubbed her hands together to warm them, the way she glanced toward the door each time it opened but never stepped closer, the way her shoes tapped lightly against the stone as if she were counting time in her own quiet way. Daniel had attended countless business meetings and formal events in his life, yet none of those moments had ever carried the strange weight that this simple scene now held, because somewhere deep in his memory, he could still recognize the feeling of standing alone on the outside of someone else's celebration and wondering if anyone would ever notice. Another gust of wind swept across the sidewalk and lifted the edge of Emma's dress slightly before settling again, and Daniel suddenly realized that he had already made the decision he had been silently debating for the last several minutes. Without drawing attention to himself, he reached for his coat draped over the chair beside the table and slipped it over his shoulders while the restaurant continued buzzing with conversation behind him and as he began walking toward the front entrance, he felt the strange certainty that the next few minutes might quietly change the direction of two lives in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. Daniel Whitmore walked steadily across the restaurant floor, while the quiet warmth of Thanksgiving dinner continued around him. The sound of gentle laughter and clinking dishes fading slightly behind him with each step toward the entrance. And although several guests briefly glanced in his direction, none of them realized that the man leaving his table was no ordinary diner, but someone whose name appeared on the front pages of business magazines across the country. The host near the front desk offered a polite smile as Daniel approached, assuming he might simply be stepping outside for a moment of fresh air, and Daniel returned the smile with a quiet nod before pushing open the tall glass door. The moment the door swung outward, the cold Chicago air rushed inside like a sharp wave carrying tiny snowflakes that drifted through the warm light spilling from the restaurant behind him. And Emma Carter slowly lifted her head from where she had been watching the pavement as she noticed the tall figure stepping onto the sidewalk. Daniel paused for a brief second, allowing the door to close gently behind him so the warm sounds of the dining room faded away, leaving only the soft whisper of wind moving through the street and the distant hum of traffic along the avenue. Emma looked up at him with quiet curiosity rather than fear, her small hands still folded together as she sat on the stone step beneath the streetlight. And Daniel realized that up close, she looked even younger than he had expected. Her cheeks slightly pink from the cold and tiny snowflakes resting in her hair. He knelt slightly so that he would not appear towering over her and spoke in a calm and gentle voice that carried the same quiet respect he used during the most serious conversations in his business life. Asking her if she had been waiting outside the restaurant for someone, Emma considered the question for a moment, as if deciding how to explain something simple but difficult, and then she gave a small shake of her head while looking toward the glowing window beside them where the Thanksgiving dinner continued inside. She explained softly that she had only been watching the families because it looked nice and warm in there, and her voice carried no anger or complaint, only a quiet honesty that made the cold night feel even heavier. Daniel listened carefully, noticing the way she tried to keep her voice steady while the wind brushed against her thin dress again, and in that moment, he understood with absolute certainty that this was not simply a child passing time outside a restaurant, but a little girl who had nowhere else to be on a night when the entire city seemed to be gathering around dinner tables with the people they loved. Daniel Whitmore remained crouched slightly, so that his eyes were level with Emma Carter, while the soft snow continued drifting around the streetlight above them. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the quiet of the cold Chicago night seemed to settle gently between their words. Emma looked toward the restaurant window again, where families inside were beginning to stand and stretch after their Thanksgiving meal, and the golden light reflected softly across the sidewalk, while the warm laughter inside felt very far away from the small step where she sat. Daniel studied the calm expression on her face and noticed something unusual that made his chest tighten slightly, because even though she was clearly cold and alone, she did not seem angry or frightened, only quietly, thoughtful in a way that felt much older than her years. He asked her gently if she had eaten dinner yet that evening, speaking slowly so his voice would not sound rushed or demanding, and Emma gave a small shake of her head while looking down at the melting snow on the stone beside her shoe, explaining in a soft voice that she had not eaten today, but that it was all right because she had seen people enjoying their dinner inside, and it looked nice. The simple honesty of her answer settled heavily in the cold air, and Daniel found himself glancing toward the restaurant window again, where plates of pie and cups of coffee were now being served to tables filled with conversation and warmth. He asked her if someone was supposed to meet her tonight, perhaps a parent or relative who might be running late, but Emma slowly lifted her eyes and explained that there was no one coming because she did not have family nearby anymore, and the way she said the words carried no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that made the moment feel even more fragile. Daniel listened carefully while the wind brushed across the sidewalk again, and tiny snowflakes gathered briefly on the shoulders of his coat, and somewhere deep in his memory, he recognized the same lonely silence he had once carried as a young boy standing outside places where other people belonged. He realized that the night had already changed for him the moment he stepped outside that restaurant door, because the little girl sitting in front of him was no longer simply a stranger on the sidewalk, but a reminder of a promise he had once made to himself many years ago. A promise that if he ever had the chance to help someone standing where he once stood, he would never walk away and pretend he had not seen them. Daniel Whitmore remained beside Emma Carter on the quiet sidewalk, while the snow continued drifting gently through the yellow glow of the streetlight, and the warm restaurant behind them felt almost like another world compared to the calm silence of the cold November night. Emma watched the soft snowflakes for a moment before speaking again in the same quiet voice, explaining that earlier in the day she had walked through several streets nearby because she knew people celebrated Thanksgiving with dinner and families, and she thought that maybe if she found a place where the lights looked warm, she could sit nearby and pretend she was part of it for a little while. Daniel listened without interrupting, while the wind moved lightly through the avenue, carrying distant sounds of traffic and the faint smell of food from the restaurant door each time it opened for guests leaving after their meal. Emma told him that she liked the way families talked to each other during dinner because it sounded friendly and safe. And even though she did not know any of the people inside, she felt less lonely watching them through the window than she would have felt sitting somewhere completely dark and quiet. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest as he heard the calm way she described her evening, because there was no complaint in her voice and no request for anything, only a simple explanation from a child who had found the nearest place that looked like warmth and chosen to sit beside it. He asked gently where she had planned to go later that night when the restaurant closed, and Emma hesitated for a moment, while looking down at the snow slowly gathering along the edge of the step, before admitting that she had not really thought that far ahead, because she had only wanted to sit somewhere that felt a little less empty for Thanksgiving. The honesty of her answer settled quietly into the cold air, and Daniel realized that every comfortable moment happening inside the restaurant suddenly felt distant and unimportant compared to the fragile reality of the little girl sitting in front of him. He slowly removed the warm wool coat from his shoulders and draped it gently around Emma so that it covered her thin dress and small arms, and although the coat looked large on her frame, she immediately pulled it closer around herself with a small look of surprise. Daniel then looked toward the glowing restaurant door and made a quiet decision that no business meeting or financial achievement had ever required him to make before, because he knew that whatever happened next would begin with one simple question he had already decided to ask. Daniel Whitmore watched Emma Carter pull the oversized coat closer around her small shoulders, while the snow continued drifting quietly beneath the streetlight, and for the first time since he had stepped outside the restaurant, he noticed a faint look of warmth returning to her face as the thick fabric shielded her from the wind. Emma lifted her eyes toward him with a quiet mixture of curiosity and gratitude, as if she were still trying to understand why a stranger would offer something so simple yet so important on a cold Thanksgiving night. And Daniel felt a steady calm settle inside him as he realized that the question he had been holding back could no longer wait. He asked gently if she would like to come inside the restaurant with him for dinner, because there was still plenty of warm food and empty chairs, and for a moment Emma did not answer because the invitation seemed almost too unexpected to believe, her eyes slowly shifting toward the glowing glass doors, where laughter and soft music drifted out each time the entrance opened for another guest leaving the celebration. She hesitated before quietly explaining that she did not want to cause trouble or make anyone uncomfortable, because she knew the restaurant looked like a very nice place where people probably came with their families, and Daniel shook his head softly, while assuring her that she would not be causing trouble at all because he was inviting her as his guest. Emma looked down at the coat wrapped around her, and then back toward the warm light behind the restaurant doors, and Daniel could see the silent debate in her eyes between hope and uncertainty, the natural caution of a child who had already learned not to expect kindness too easily. The wind moved gently through the street again, while snowflakes brushed against the sidewalk, And Daniel extended his hand in a calm and patient gesture that carried no pressure or urgency, only the simple promise that she would not have to remain outside any longer if she did not want to. After a quiet moment, Emma slowly stood from the stone step, the coat nearly reaching her knees as she balanced herself. And although she did not speak immediately, she gave a small nod that told Daniel everything he needed to know. Together, they turned toward the glowing restaurant entrance, and as the door opened, the warm air and golden light spilled across the sidewalk once more, welcoming the little girl who had spent the evening watching Thanksgiving from the outside into a room where her life was about to change in a way she could not yet imagine. The warm air of the restaurant wrapped around Emma Carter the moment she stepped through the door beside Daniel Whitmore, and for a brief second, she stopped just inside the entrance, as if she needed time to understand the sudden change between the cold, snowy sidewalk and the soft, golden light filling the dining room. The gentle sound of conversations and clinking dishes drifted through the space, while the smell of roasted turkey, fresh bread, and pumpkin pie seemed almost overwhelming compared to the quiet street she had been sitting on only moments earlier. Several guests near the entrance glanced toward the small girl wearing the oversized coat that reached nearly to her knees, but Daniel's calm presence beside her carried the quiet confidence of someone who belonged anywhere he chose to stand, and the brief looks of curiosity quickly faded back into the normal rhythm of Thanksgiving dinner. Daniel guided Emma slowly toward his table near the window where the untouched plate of food still waited, and as they walked, Emma looked around the room with careful wonder, noticing the candles flickering softly on the tables and families leaning close together in conversation. The exact same scenes she had been watching through the glass earlier that night. When they reached the table, Daniel gently pulled out the chair for her and helped her settle into the seat. And Emma hesitated for a moment before sitting down as if she were worried the moment might somehow disappear if she moved too quickly. The coat remained wrapped around her shoulders, while the warmth of the room slowly replaced the cold that had settled in her hands and cheeks outside. A server approached the table with a polite smile, recognizing Daniel from earlier in the evening, and Daniel calmly explained that his guest had just arrived and would also need a Thanksgiving dinner. The server nodded warmly without hesitation and returned a few minutes later carrying a plate filled with turkey mashed potatoes, stuffing, and cranberry sauce, setting it carefully in front of Emma as the steam from the food rose gently into the air. Emma stared quietly at the plate for a moment, the soft light reflecting in her eyes, and Daniel noticed the way she held her hands together in her lap, as if she were unsure whether it was truly meant for her. He gave her a reassuring nod and told her gently that the dinner was hers to enjoy, and slowly Emma reached for the fork beside the plate, while the warm Thanksgiving room continued glowing around her. No longer something she could only watch through a window, but a place where she now finally had a seat. Emma Carter held the fork carefully in her small hand, while the warm Thanksgiving dinner rested in front of her, and for several seconds, she simply looked at the plate as if she were trying to confirm that the moment was real and not something that might disappear the way warm light had disappeared each time the restaurant door closed earlier that night. The steam rising from the turkey and mashed potatoes drifted gently upward, while the soft glow of the candle on the table reflected in her eyes, and Daniel Whitmore noticed the quiet concentration on her face as she slowly took her first small bite. The change in her expression was almost immediate, as warmth and surprise replaced the cautious stillness she had carried outside in the cold. And although she did not speak right away, the faint smile forming at the corner of her mouth said more than words could have. Around them, the restaurant continued with the comfortable rhythm of Thanksgiving evening, as families finished their meals and servers cleared plates, while soft music played above the quiet conversations. Yet at that small table near the window, the moment felt different from everything else happening in the room because Emma was experiencing something she had only watched from the outside a short time earlier. Daniel rested his hands calmly on the table while observing the simple joy in the way she tasted each part of the meal, the turkey, the warm stuffing, the sweet cranberry sauce, and he felt a quiet realization settle deeply inside him that the success he had spent years building in boardrooms and offices suddenly seemed far less meaningful than the simple act of sharing dinner with a child who had been sitting alone in the snow. Emma eventually looked up at him with a shy but genuine smile and thanked him softly for bringing her inside, explaining that it was the nicest Thanksgiving dinner she had ever had, and the honesty in her voice carried no exaggeration, only pure gratitude that filled the space between them with a quiet warmth stronger than the restaurant lights. Daniel nodded gently while listening to her. Yet in his mind, another thought had already begun to take shape, a decision far greater than offering a warm meal for one evening. Because as he watched the little girl sitting across from him, he realized that the story of this night could not simply end when the plates were cleared and the restaurant lights dimmed. Somewhere deep inside his heart, a new possibility had begun to grow, one that would soon lead him to ask a question that could change the direction of Emma Carter's life forever. Emma Carter slowly finished the last few bites of her Thanksgiving dinner, while the warmth of the restaurant settled comfortably around her, and the earlier chill from the snowy sidewalk had completely faded from her small hands as she rested the fork gently beside the plate. The quiet satisfaction on her face was something Daniel Whitmore noticed immediately, because it was not the excitement of a child receiving a gift, but the peaceful relief of someone who had finally found warmth after a long, cold evening. Around them, the restaurant had begun to grow calmer as several families prepared to leave after their celebration chairs, sliding softly across the floor, while servers cleared dishes and replaced them with cups of coffee and slices of pie for the guests who remained. Emma watched the soft activity of the room with quiet fascination, occasionally glancing toward the window where the snow continued falling outside. And Daniel realized that only a short time earlier, that exact view had been the place where she had been sitting alone in the cold. He leaned forward slightly and asked her in a gentle voice if there was anywhere safe she could go after dinner that night. Perhaps a relative or a neighbor who might be expecting her. And Emma hesitated before slowly explaining that there was not really anyone waiting for her anymore, because her mother had passed away the previous year, and her father had left their small apartment several months ago, promising he would come back, but never returning. The words were spoken quietly and without anger, as if she had already grown used to telling the simple truth of her situation. Daniel listened carefully while the soft restaurant lights reflected off the polished table between them, and for a moment, he looked toward the snowy street outside, where the night continued moving through the city without noticing the small life that had been sitting alone earlier. He then returned his attention to Emma and spoke with the same calm certainty that had guided every important decision of his life, explaining that he did not believe a child should ever have to spend a night like this alone, and that he would make sure she had somewhere warm and safe to stay. Emma looked at him with quiet surprise, the large coat still wrapped around her shoulders, and although she did not yet understand exactly what he meant, she felt the steady confidence in his voice, the kind of calm promise that sounded stronger than the cold winter night waiting outside the restaurant doors. The restaurant had grown quieter as the evening moved deeper into the night, and the soft glow of the lights reflected gently across the windows, while the snowfall outside continued drifting through the Chicago streets. Emma Carter sat calmly at the table with Daniel Whitmore, the large coat still wrapped around her shoulders, as if it had become a small shield of comfort that she was not ready to remove yet. The plates from dinner had been cleared away, and a small slice of pumpkin pie now rested on the table between them, the warm scent of cinnamon filling the air, while Emma took small, careful bites and occasionally glanced toward the snowy window, as if remembering how different the night had felt only an hour earlier. Daniel remained quietly thoughtful as he watched her, and the calm decision that had begun forming inside his mind earlier had now grown into something clear and steady. He asked Emma gently if she had ever spoken to a social worker or someone from the city who helped children find safe places to live when they did not have family nearby. And Emma slowly shook her head while explaining that she had mostly been moving from one temporary place to another since her father disappeared, sometimes staying with neighbors or in short-term shelters that always felt crowded and unfamiliar. The honesty in her voice carried no complaint, only a simple description of the life she had learned to navigate on her own. Daniel listened carefully while the quiet sounds of the restaurant faded around them, and he knew that the promise he had spoken earlier could not remain only words shared over dinner. He calmly reached for his phone and stepped a few feet away from the table so Emma could finish her pie in peace, and within a few minutes, he had contacted a trusted legal advisor who had worked with him for many years, explaining that he needed guidance on how to begin the process of ensuring a safe and permanent future for a child he had just met that evening. When he returned to the table, Emma looked up with quiet curiosity, and Daniel smiled gently while telling her that the night was not ending with a goodbye at the restaurant door because he intended to help make sure she would never again have to search for a warm place to sit on a cold Thanksgiving evening. The last of the dinner guests slowly began leaving the restaurant, while the quiet warmth of the evening settled gently over the dining room, and outside the tall windows, the snowfall had grown steadier, covering the Chicago sidewalks in a thin white layer that reflected the streetlights like soft silver. Emma Carter watched the snow through the glass with calm fascination, while Daniel Whitmore settled back into his chair across from her, the quiet phone call he had just finished still echoing in his thoughts as a clear plan began forming for the days ahead. Emma had finished the slice of pumpkin pie and now rested her hands on the edge of the table, the large coat still wrapped around her shoulders, as if it had become part of her evening. And although she was warm and comfortable now, there was still a small uncertainty in her eyes, as if she could not fully believe that the kindness of the night might continue beyond the restaurant walls. Daniel leaned forward slightly and spoke to her with the same steady calm that had guided every important moment of his life, explaining that he had spoken with someone who could help make sure she would have a safe place to stay and people who would work with him to find the best future for her. Emma listened quietly, her small expression thoughtful, as she tried to understand the meaning behind his words, and Daniel reassured her that nothing would happen suddenly or without care, but that he would be there to make sure she was never left alone again on a cold night. The simple promise settled between them like the warm glow of the restaurant lights, and Emma gave a small nod, as if part of her heart had begun to believe him. When the server returned with the final bill, Daniel thanked her kindly and prepared to leave, and as he stood, he gently helped Emma slip her arms back into the sleeves of the coat before guiding her toward the entrance. The moment the door opened, the cool winter air brushed against them again, but this time the night felt completely different, because Emma was not stepping outside alone beneath the snow. She was walking beside someone who had already decided that the story of her life would no longer be written by loneliness or cold sidewalks, but by the promise that one unexpected evening had quietly placed a new path in front of her. Snow continued falling softly over the Chicago streets as Daniel Whitmore and Emma Carter stepped away from the warm restaurant and onto the quiet sidewalk. Yet the cold night no longer carried the same lonely silence it had earlier, because Emma was now walking beside someone who had already decided she would not face the world alone anymore. The streetlights reflected across the thin layer of snow while Daniel guided her carefully toward a black car waiting near the curb, and Emma looked up at the tall buildings and glowing windows around them with a calm curiosity, as if the city itself had suddenly become a new place she had never fully seen before. When they reached the car, Daniel opened the door for her and helped her climb into the warm back seat where the heater was already running, and Emma pulled the coat closer around her shoulders while watching the snow drift past the window. For a moment she said nothing, quietly absorbing the strange turn the evening had taken, from sitting alone on a cold stone step outside a restaurant to riding through the city beside a man who spoke with a steady kindness she had never experienced before. Daniel settled into the seat beside her and gently explained that they were going somewhere safe for the night, where she could rest and stay warm while the people he had contacted earlier began helping arrange the next steps for her future. Emma listened carefully and then looked out the window again as the car moved slowly through the snowy streets, the lights of Chicago passing one by one like quiet promises in the winter night. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to believe that the world ahead might hold more than cold sidewalks and silent windows. The car moved quietly through the snowy streets of Chicago, while the city lights reflected across the windows like soft golden ribbons stretching through the winter night. And Emma Carter watched the passing buildings with calm curiosity while the warmth inside the car wrapped around her in a way that felt very different from the cold sidewalk where the evening had begun. The large coat still rested around her shoulders, and she held the edges of it gently, as if it were a small reminder that everything that had happened inside the restaurant had truly been real. Daniel Whitmore sat beside her and allowed the quiet moment to settle naturally, without rushing her with questions, because he understood that a night filled with so many unexpected changes could take time for a child to fully understand. After several minutes, Emma finally spoke softly and asked where they were going, her voice carrying more curiosity than worry. And Daniel answered with the same calm steadiness she had heard from him all evening, explaining that they were heading to a comfortable home where she could stay safely while the people he trusted began working through the steps needed to give her a more permanent future. Emma listened carefully while the snow continued drifting across the windshield and the car turned slowly onto a quieter street, lined with tall trees and warm porch lights glowing in the distance. She looked out at the peaceful neighborhood and then back at Daniel, and although she did not say many words, the gentle look in her eyes carried the beginning of something new, a small but growing sense that the world ahead might finally hold a place where she belonged. Outside the car, the snow continued falling softly across the quiet neighborhood, while the journey that had begun with a lonely step outside a restaurant window slowly carried Emma Carter toward a life she had never believed could be waiting for her. The car finally slowed as it turned into a quiet driveway where warm lights glowed softly from the windows of a large but welcoming home, and the snow continued drifting down across the trees and rooftops, while the peaceful neighborhood seemed far away from the busy city streets where the evening had begun. Emma Carter looked out through the window with quiet amazement as the car came to a gentle stop, her small reflection appearing in the glass, while the porch light illuminated the falling snow like tiny stars drifting through the air. Daniel Whitmore stepped out first and walked around to open the door for her, offering his hand in the same calm and steady way he had earlier that night outside the restaurant. And Emma accepted it carefully as she stepped onto the snow-covered driveway with the coat still wrapped around her shoulders. For a moment, she looked back at the quiet street and the softly falling snow, as if remembering the long, cold evening that had started with her sitting alone outside a warm window watching other families celebrate. Daniel noticed the thoughtful expression on her face and spoke gently, explaining that sometimes life could change in ways no one expected, especially on nights when people needed kindness the most. Emma looked up at him and then toward the welcoming house again, where warm light shined through the windows, and although she did not fully understand what the future would bring, she felt something inside her that she had not felt in a long time, the quiet beginning of hope. Together, they walked toward the front door while the snow continued falling softly around them, and somewhere far behind them, the restaurant window where Emma had once watched Thanksgiving from the cold sidewalk remained just another small moment in the past, while the life waiting ahead of her had finally begun to open like a warm light in the middle of a winter night. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.